Morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Data Colada seminar. It is my pleasure today to have introduce Juliana Schroeder, who's going to be speaking today, as well as her set of panelists, Nick Epley, Eli Finkel, Deb Grunfeld, Ashley Martin, and Mary Steffel. In addition to all of them, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson will be here as well. For those of you who haven't been here before, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. When you submit things through the Q&A function, they come for all of us to see. And when possible, we try to articulate those questions to Juliana so that she can answer them. And even if we don't get a chance to get to every question that's submitted, all of them are saved and she'll be able to read them after the talk is over. There's also a chat function at the bottom. Don't use that because it's distracting for everybody. So use the Q&A function, works really well. Okay, with that, the floor is yours, Juliana. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about this work on perceptions of people's needs. So I should be sharing my screen. Can everyone see it? Perfect. Okay. So this is work joint with Nick Epley, who's here with us, so he can jump in and tell me when I'm doing anything wrong at any point. But I want to start with a motivating example for all of you. And so I'm going to talk about this program that was developed in Portland, Oregon to deal with some of the homelessness that's there. So anyone who's ever been to Oregon knows that there are a lot of homeless people that are in that area. And this program was developed almost 20 years ago now, and they called it Dignity Village. And it was a bit controversial at the time because it's unusual in that it not only sought to provide housing for these individuals, but it also sought to try to fulfill more of their emotional needs. So there were counseling programs, there were social connection programs, even events for the people that lived in this village. And the idea, of course, this is how it got the term, was to restore dignity among this set of people. And so I was, interested in what were the reactions to this program. And so searching for this took me into the rabbit hole of Reddit. All right. And so you can see from different users' reactions to this that they didn't always like the idea of this program. So here's one user who said, obviously, they're handling homeless people the wrong way. Why should we throw parties and pay for them to regain dignity when they just need housing? Here's another user that said, Portland, I guess, is now the city of protecting the feelings of homeless people, as if their feelings really matter. And so, there's a lot going on in people's psychological reactions to this program, but in particular, I want to focus on one theme that seemed to be emerging from a lot of the comments, which was that there's this presumption that the psychological needs of homeless people, why focus on those so much? The basic physical needs are the things that need to be satisfied, right? So do the psychological needs really matter here, or really should we be focusing on the physical needs? And this, we thought, might have some psychology that suggests that people think of those psychological needs as being less important than the physical needs. All right, and we'll get to, where's the answer, what's the reality of this, and some of the data later on, hopefully. But, we see this type of perception, not just in Reddit user threads, but also we see it in the academic literature to some extent. So here's a quote from a paper I think highlights, it captures a similar psychology. And this quote says, in certain people, the level of aspiration might be permanently deadened or lowered. That is to say, the less prepotent goals may simply be lost and may disappear forever, so that the person who has experienced life at a very low level, i.e. chronic unemployment, may continue to be satisfied for the rest of his life if he can only get enough food. All right, so again, you're seeing this theme here of, okay, that in this certain type of person, their aspirations are deadened. They really maybe just would care about food. And so where does this quote come from? Does anyone know, panelists? This is like a quiz. I'm going to keep quizzing you. So this is Maslow, Abraham Maslow. Nick knew the answer to that, but he stayed quiet. Okay, so this is his famous paper in 1943. And so on the topic of Maslow, he has, very famously categorized all the different needs that people have. And so whenever any audience I speak to always recognizes this, it's been cited more than 35,000 times on Google Scholar. And it's very interesting to sort of think about the different needs that have been categorized into this pyramid. But one thing that Nick and I noticed when we look at this is that the needs that are up at the top, so self-actualizing, having meaning and purpose, the self-esteem, even the social needs to some extent, those seem to be more psychological in nature. And the ones at the bottom are more physical, of course, in nature. And so that's one way to think about how these needs could be categorized. And the psychological needs, of course, those are things that we think of probably, I'm not going to make an argument about what reality is, as being more unique to humans. Humans care about those things. Those are things that seem like they need mental capacity in some way to be up at the top there. And then the lower level things, eating, sleeping, drinking, those are things that presumably every creature that has a body on this earth probably needs. So even the cockroach kind of needs some of those things at the bottom there. And one other thing that we kind of notice is that the things up at the top, these psychological higher level needs, are things that are less observable immediately. And the things at the bottom are probably more observable. So what do I mean by that? Let me kind of give you a few examples here. Is like, how do you really know which of these needs are important to others? We're constantly seeing evidence that people care about their physical needs, but those are things that need to be satisfied, right? So we're always, we're seeing people eating, we're seeing drinking. That's something that Joe is demonstrating it right now in the panel. Thank you, Joe. And then the psychological needs, well, it's a little less clear. So, to what extent does Leif care about self-actualization? I know him, so I think he cares a lot about it. And the more you know someone, I think the more you recognize these things. But even trying to find like the Google stock photo of like, what does someone look like when they're really self-actualizing is quite challenging. Maybe it's the thinking phase here. And in particular, what we reasoned in this project is that if these physical needs are more accessible, the psychological ones, you kind of need to have more introspection, try more kind of access into the person's mind to recognize the extent to which they care about those different needs. And so that led us to think that there might be a self-other difference here. So because of course for the self, you already have access into your mind, about your different needs. I know that I really care about having meaning and purpose. What I don't know about is Deb as much. And so if you think about these different need types, the psychological needs and the physical needs, and then think about the extent to which they might be important to different individuals, particularly like the self versus other people, what we would expect here, and this follows from a large literature, I'm not citing all the literature here, is that for the self, you're going to think of those psychological needs as being potentially more important than for another individual. For the physical needs, they would be relatively seen as probably similar importance. There's a little bit of reason to believe that even for the physical needs, the self might experience those needs a bit more strongly or deeply than others. And then so in terms of all the different comparisons you can make here, you can also think about, the verticals too. So within others in particular, I think this suggests that the psychological needs might be seen as generally a little bit less important than the physical needs. And we're going to call that demeaning in this paper. That's just a term we're going to use for this. Okay, so of course, there's a lot of prior literature that speaks to some of these self-other differences already, a lot of great work. I'll highlight just a few examples. So Chip Heath's extrinsic incentives bias, a really fantastic paper, basically it shows that people seem to be more, believe that others are more motivated by extrinsic incentives, but that the self is more motivated by intrinsic incentives. So asking questions like, how important is learning new things to you versus others? And people are saying that, yeah, that's an intrinsic thing. It's more important to me than to others. Another example comes from Miller and Ratner, 1998. So the norms of self-interest. So here they ask questions like, why do you, Mary, go and donate blood versus why do other people do it? And for you, Mary, for you, probably you think like, I'm altruistic. I care about helping others. But why do other people do it? Maybe they're doing it, more for the money here. Okay, so some of these things have shown up, these glimmers of this have shown up in the literature, and we think that underlying these other effects probably are these broader differences in how people are perceiving the needs of themselves and others. But you might be, and you should be, a panelist, thinking about, okay, well, this is a little simplistic, Juliana, because of course we can categorize different others in different ways. So there, there might be some individuals or groups of individuals who are seen to have very important high-level needs, others that are, seen to have psychological needs, others that maybe are seen to have less important psychological needs. And so thinking back again on these need types, you can imagine that there are certain group members that are kind of exemplified, and this is kind of hypothetical, we don't have a lot of data on this category in particular, as having like more mind than body. And Eli, I know your picture is in here. I'm not just talking about you specifically, Eli. You are representing sort of the professor group here, right? So you could imagine, perhaps lawyers and particular types of lawyers in the fight for justice, that might be seen as, they might be seen as having more psychological needs, maybe charity donors, possibly professors are in this group. It's interesting to think about. And then in terms of, are there groups that are particularly defined by the physical needs? Well, of course, we've already talked about one, homeless people. You might imagine, prisoners might kind of fall into this category. Of course, any non-human animal examples you could think of would probably fall more into this category. These are seen as, agents that have more body than mind. And in particular, that category, I think, fits really well with what the prior literature has shown as being dehumanized group members. And we think that, that there's no coincidence there. So the way that we think about dehumanization is that when you think of an agent as having weaker mental capacity, that's sort of fundamentally dehumanizing. And those should be the agents in which you think of them as having weaker psychological needs as well. So maybe more focus on the body than on the mind. Okay, so I'm going to dive into hypotheses. I'll pause to see if the panelists have any questions on any of that kind of setup here.
Juliana, I was wondering if you thought at all about other kinds of moderators. Like, I was thinking sort of like an intrapersonal moderator. Like, when I feel really hungry, I think other people are going to feel hungry too. Maybe when I feel really lonely, I feel like maybe I'm less likely to make this kind of mistake there. Like, have you looked at any kind of like projection effects that might result from feeling these kinds of needs more or less intensely? And do you think that's playing any role here?
It's such a great question. And actually, it gets to something even broader, which is about states and traits a bit in terms of needs. So, and this is something that we grapple with a lot kind of in the research. And I think there's more to probably be done still, Nick. But here we're kind of asking about it, and you'll see in the methodology, we're asking about like, how important is it to you to feel loved, to have meaning in your life, to satisfy hunger? And I think people are thinking about more on kind of a trait basis, as opposed to, but of course these things can vary from animals. Like right now, I haven't had breakfast. It's early on the West Coast. And so, hunger might be something in particular, the need to eat is something that's maybe a little bit more on my mind. But overall, when I'm evaluating whether that need is important to me in a broader sense, maybe I think it's less important than some of these higher level psychological needs. And so I think there's different ways you could think about capturing these. And this also gets to this broader debate about Maslow's hierarchy in general, right? Whether is it really a hierarchy, or do people basically pursue these needs in parallel, which frankly, I think there's more empirical evidence for the latter at this point. And so really we're going to be focusing more on kind of the trait-based perceptions of these needs, the more long-term perceptions of these, as opposed to sort of state. But I think, Joe, that you're right, that in any given moment, you could imagine that some of these needs are going to be more important than others, and that could influence the way you're thinking about other people's needs as well. We didn't really look at that here. So we're not kind of capturing like moment to moment variation.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. I was just interested in that. Thanks.
Yeah, good question.
So Juliana, I know that you're going to be focusing on sort of the psychological needs versus more physical needs, but within sort of the middle of Maslow's pyramid, we've got the need for belonging and love, and that I know in your work that sometimes hangs in the middle, sometimes hangs with the top psychological needs. So I was curious whether you've thought at all about the extent to which, the psychological needs really encompasses any of that mental activity that's going on inside of people, whether it's primarily the cognitive side of things or whether that also includes potentially some of the emotional activity that's going on inside of people. So I wonder if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, so we think of it as both the psychological, like the cognitive and the emotional aspects. So those would both be considered psychological. So if you kind of go back to Maslow's 5 different categories that he set out, I think you're right about the belonging and the safety needs as being a little bit questionable about whether they fit more with the psychological or with the physical. And so Nick, I'm sure you could go into detail on this too. We grapple with this quite a bit in terms of thinking about, well, are those more psychological or physical? I actually think, Eli, you might find this interesting, that someone could do an entire project just looking at the belonging needs, because I think those certainly have psychological components. They certainly have physical components as well. And so we ended up basically putting them into like a middle level. So we're like, okay, so they're mixed. They have both psychological and physical aspects across all the empirical studies. And this paper just came out in JPSB, so you can look it up there as well for more details. We did a lot of like factor analyzing to try to figure out where different perceptions fall. And one thing that we see is that the belongingness needs, depending on the context, sometimes they fit more with the higher level, sometimes they fit more psychological, and sometimes they fit more in like basically a middle level by themselves. So yeah, I think it's a bit sort of debatable where they could fall. I think, there are certain things that are pretty clearly only psychological, like, the pursuing purpose and having esteem. There's certain things that are clearly primarily physical, like food. And then there's these kind of mixed ones that could fall either way. So maybe Mary, just kind of like keep thinking about that as I show you the data, and you can bring it back up again if you want. Good question. Okay, you guys want to see some data. So just kind of outline the different hypotheses that we have here. So, one is that we're thinking that others' physical needs will tend to seem more important than their psychological needs on average, but that this will be moderated by certain intergroup stereotypes. In particular, we're going to look at when that effect is exacerbated, particularly for these dehumanized others, those that are seen as having the weaker mental capacities. But even that you would see this effect among peers, individuals that are within your same group, and that should be because of the mechanism that we think is going on, which we think, and you guys feel free to argue with me, that it's about lacking introspective access, so lacking really deep access into the mind of another person, right? You have more for yourself, so that's why we think there'll just be a basic self-other difference. And then finally, we're going to look at, of course, you do these perceptions of other people's needs. Do they have any behavioral consequences at all? And as I started with like the homeless person example, we'll dive into that context a little more detail. We'll look at helping behavior there. Okay. So to kind of to Joe's question about the methods and how we're thinking about measuring different needs. So we co-opt the hierarchy, and we basically made it into a scale. So we came up with scale items at every level of Maslow's hierarchy. And so the lowest level, we have eating food, drinking, and sleeping. Of course, you could imagine other things that could have fit into these different levels. And there's a lot, you guys should think carefully about the measurement that we used as we go through different studies here. The safety needs, so feeling safe, having routine and predictability in life. The belonging needs, feeling loved, getting affection. The esteem needs, feeling respected, achieving personal and professional goals. And then self-actualization needs, living with meaning and purpose, feeling independent, and then realizing potential in life. And then for our purposes, we don't particularly care about Maslow. We just are co-opting these different categories, and we care about separating them into more of the physical versus the psychological needs, which you see in this last column here. Okay, and then the way we're going to ask this question to participants is we're just going to ask, how important is feeling loved, Deb, to you, right? And again, like this is not just, state. So, Deb, I don't know how much you care about me loving you in this moment particularly. It's more about, how important is that to you overall? I think that's the way participants are interpreting it, but you can look at the data and tell me what you guys think. Okay, so here's an experiment we started with. This is pre-registered on MTurk, and we asked people to judge the needs of 8 different agents. Okay, so we can imagine you can pick any number of different group members that they could judge. We started with these. It might look like a bit of a random set, but there's theoretical reasons for why we selected these different agents. So the self and close friend, those are ones that would be seen as highly humanized. Those are ones where we think people should be pretty aware of the psychological needs of those agents. A lawyer, elderly person, child, these are ones that, Fisk et al. Have looked at as being mixed stereotype. So lawyer is characterized by high competence, but lower warmth. Elderly person, child are more experiential, maybe less cognitive capacity is sometimes seen as having, right? Child, really has less cognitive capacity, as we know. And then the drug addict and the homeless person, those are more of these dehumanized agents. And then the chimpanzee, of course, is our non-human comparison point here. So that's the non-human animal. Okay, and so again, we are asking about the scale that we developed. How important are these different needs? So eating, drinking, sleeping, the middle level needs, and then the psychological needs here. Okay, and how important are these different needs to you, and how important are these different needs to the target? All right, and so between subjects, everyone is evaluating these different targets. Okay, so here are the results on the y-axis. You have the rating of the need importance on a 1 to 7 scale there. And then we have all the different targets along the x-axis. And so you can imagine there are going to be a lot of bars I'm going to show you. So let me, I'm going to show it to you in terms of each level. Okay, so on the lower level needs, we're really not expecting to see a lot of variance across these different targets in terms of how much physical need that they have. In fact, we're really expecting to see almost no variance here. You see there is a little bit of variance, not that meaningful. What's going on, Juliana, with the drug addict? The drug addict, we didn't really expect this, but post hoc, it kind of makes sense. They're not really seen as having the same types of physical needs. They're seen as being kind of consumed for the need to have drugs. This is actually like a broader thing that we see across studies, which is that people tend to be more myopic in thinking about others' needs. So they often I think this kind of fits with stereotyping. They categorize others as having, one or two particular needs, whereas the self is, of course, seen as having lots of needs. And so, there's something kind of interesting potentially going on with that. But that wasn't really what we were focused on here. Middle level needs, you see like a little bit of variance happening. But then the perception of the higher level, the psychological needs, here's where you see people really differentiating across the different targets here. And in particular, the gap between the low and the high level is something we are looking at, defining as demeaning. So you see that gap is very large for chimpanzee, but also for homeless, child, drug addict. And in fact, I can kind of clear these bars for you because this is a lot of data, and just show you perceptions of the high level needs. The red bars here I think are particularly interesting. And so you see this kind of pattern that's quite interesting. And we would say, even this pattern suggests that this is how people perceive the levels of humanness of these targets to some extent, right? I mean, at least in this particular measure. And so, the self and the close friend, those are seen as, having highly important psychological needs. The chimpanzee, not so much. It's not really surprising to see that for the perceptions of the chimpanzee's needs, but it is pretty interesting to see that, the drug addict and the homeless person, the child, they're seen, more like the chimpanzee's needs than like the self or a friend. And then I don't know that this audience will care that much about it, but I'll just show you that, in terms of how this tracks with other measures of dehumanization. So here again are the perceptions of the high level needs I just showed you. And then essentially there's these like two different dimensions, human uniqueness and human nature. And the human uniqueness is the more like cognitive dimension, and human nature is the more experiential dimension. And so it tracks more with the more cognitive dimension. So you kind of see it most strongly on like child and chimpanzee, where like the child is, highly experiential, like high human nature, low human uniqueness, chimpanzee, kind of the same thing. And the perceptions of the high level needs are tracking more with the kind of the human uniqueness traits, which makes a lot of sense here.
Juliana, oh, Eli has a question.
I'll pause. And Ashley, I thought, yeah, you might be the only one who might be kind of interested in this slide.
Very interested.
But,
I have a question actually about the targets you chose that were the dehumanized ones. I was thinking about them in terms of the mind perception model and how a lot of them are high on experience and low on agency. And so it would make sense that you diminish the importance of their, I guess, agentic, I'll call these agentic needs, like actualization, esteem, all these kind of self-motivated needs. I wonder if you used dehumanized targets that were high on agency and low on experience, if you would find the same effect, or if you would find that they are understanding that they don't need those belonging needs. I guess, do you think that it matters that the dehumanized targets you use and the dimensions on which they're dehumanized?
Yeah, so I would say that, you know, even the lawyer to some extent hasn't really been looked at in terms of agency experience, but it has in terms of competence and warmth. And there you do see them as being perceived as having these more important higher level psychological needs. And so I would think that any particular targets, I don't know if you had one in mind in particular you want to talk about, Ashley, that are seen as being more agentic will also be seen as having more of the psychological needs. I think we would expect it to follow that pattern. Nick, do you have anything you want to add into that? You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm typing into this question and answer box.
And Nick is doing a great job answering all of your questions.
No, I'm not. This is like terrible, but sort of just want people to read the paper. But anyway, sorry. What was I supposed to chime in on here?
Whether do you think, so I was saying that for the high targets that seem to be like high competency, high agency, but low warmth, like low experience, we probably would think of them as being perceived to have high psychological needs, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the stuff that's related to competency and about agency usually requires thinking. And so we'd expect them to be higher on these psychological needs.
Yeah. Okay.
The emotional stuff is more sort of automatic, almost physical.
I mean, the thing, sorry, not to keep going on it, but the thing that made me think that is that the lawyer was seen as not having as many mid-level needs, so the needs for belonging and stuff. So that's what kind of made me think that these dimensions might be different. But I think it's interesting, and I will stop talking.
Definitely. Eli, what were you going to say?
I was just wondering if we were to stipulate two things about the people in your sample. One is that they are implicit Maslowians rather, that they think that there is a hierarchy of needs, whether there is in fact a hierarchy or not, but in the way Maslow talked about them. And then we also stipulate that your targets vary in how they are perceived as having access to the sorts of food and safety needs, the physiological and safety needs toward the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. I wonder if that wouldn't be sufficient as like one explanation of how you get the pattern. I was just thinking, like, we sort of have a stereotype of the drug addict who comes off a high and then opens the fridge and there's just moldy cheese, or the chimpanzee obviously has to find food on a day-to-day basis, homeless person, child. Elderly is a little bit trickier, but if your stereotype of an elderly person is somebody who's a little frail and can't necessarily make food at any moment in time, I just wondered, would that be a plausible explanation for this pattern, the combination of implicit Maslowian and then the variation that people might perceive in the ability to meet low-level needs?
Yeah, so I certainly think that there's perception of variability to meet low-level needs and high-level needs here. I'm not quite following you on what you think of as what counts as an implicit Maslowian. It's like we all think that there's a hierarchy, or that these participants in particular do, or
that for agents or targets in this case that are less able to meet their own low-level needs, at will, that they will sort of get fixated on those and therefore focus less on the high-level needs.
Oh, I see. So you're saying that some of these targets are seen as being not as able to meet their low-level needs, and so yeah. No, I think that's definitely interesting. It could somewhat explain like these particular targets. I don't think that'll, the very next study I'll show you is looking at needs of peers. And so there, wouldn't explain any gaps that we see between self and a peer's needs at all. One thing that I was thinking, like even last night, that would be interesting to do, just to throw this out, would be, what about like for an obese person? It's interesting for them because presumably like those do people see them as having an important need for low-level things like eating, or because it's more maybe satiety? I think that one might be interesting. I think I would probably assume that people would see them as more having the lower level needs as being more important, but that could be like one interesting target to kind of look at that. But yeah, I see what you're saying, Eli. I think that maybe for these particular targets, that could be a confound here.
I have a question. I'm stuck a little bit on the lawyer. The data surprised me a little bit, and then the explanation for it also surprises me a little bit. I don't see lawyers the same way, I guess. But it makes me wonder about your mechanism and what you're actually thinking is going on with.
And by the way, you can imagine different types of lawyers, like the corporate lawyer versus criminal justice might be seen differently. And this is
yeah, totally. And I guess what I'm thinking about more is like the idea of how to reconcile perceiving a target as being very high in competence and cold, while simultaneously imputing psychological needs to them. Like somehow that doesn't really compute for me. And so what I'm wondering about is, when you say that this effect has to do with like whether you infer, weaker mental capacities or stronger mental capacities, I was just wondering whether you think whether what you're really referring to has to do with like a sense of self, which is a completely different way. I mean, it's a more the way you're talking about mental capacities is much broader. And like that, so when I think about like a target that's highly rational, for example, like it just doesn't compute with me to be thinking of them as, interested in self-actualization. Like self-esteem I can see because it's like a status striving thing.
Esteem is in this, yeah.
Right, that's right. So I guess what I'm wondering is whether you think it has to do with imputing sense of self or self-conscious awareness, as opposed to something like the broad category of mental capacity.
But I think imputing a sense of self that is a psychological need, right? I mean, that fits with, you can't impute a sense of self without having mental capacity to some extent, right? So I think that's probably part of it.
I think that's right. I guess what I'm wondering is whether the distinction is important to you in your model, or whether you assume like, is it just like intelligence?
Yeah, I don't think it's just intelligence. In fact, we actually measured trait intelligence, just perceptions of intelligence, in another study, and that doesn't really, although it follows kind of similar patterns, it doesn't account for the effect fully. I think this is, it's definitely something broader about the psychological needs. Maybe this is like part of it, Deb, is like it's in a big category. So like psychological needs could be more cognitive, they could be more emotional, they could be more, status based. And so maybe there's work to be done in terms of unpacking that category, which would be pretty interesting. But I think, like, could you think of a target or two where we could try to differentiate between the different mechanisms that you're thinking of? Interesting.
I have to think about it a little bit more. Part of it's not the psychological need thing that I'm stuck on, it's the mental capacity thing more that I'm trying to really grasp. To understand what you mean by that. And part of what's informing my thinking is just the idea of whether these processes have to do with going up and down the food chain. Somehow the lawyer example it's not fitting the way I would think about the inferences people make based on cold and competent. I could imagine doing it based on similarity in a status sense, like maybe your participants can identify with being a lawyer. I don't know, but it's the one piece of the story that has my it's not fully computing for me.
Yeah, I think there's definitely more to explore. I think you could be dehumanizing lawyers a little bit here. I'm just, but the way that we're thinking about this is that, to the extent that any particular agent and different types of agents are seen as having these psychological needs, that's something to have those needs. It requires that you've got these mental faculties that would be both the cognitive and the kind of emotional faculties. And so that's where you're starting to see these different perceptions across the group members. But really, like, where we think this stems from, like, on a deeper psychological level is just the fact that some of these things are more accessible than others. And the physical things are more accessible. You can see them, they're more observable. And so that's where the kind of the basic self-other difference comes from. But yeah, just you can continue sort of thinking and percolating. If you have like a specific set of targets that you think could sort of help differentiate differences that might happen in the different perceptions of different types of psychological needs, I would love to hear it. Actually, part of this whole talk is just to convince Nick to do more follow-up work with me. So please. Okay, let me move forward. So I wanted to look at the opposite side of this. Are there any agents that are seen as actually having more important psychological needs than physical needs? You can see even for the self, it might have gotten missed because there are so many bars here, but even for the self, you can see that people rate their own physical needs as being more important than their psychological needs on this scale. So are there any agents in which you would see that? So we did another study. Again, this is an online study, pre-registered, and we had our chimpanzee target, we had the self. And so the chimpanzee is, more seen probably as more body than mind. We already know that. The self, both body and mind. And then what would be sort of an agent that's seen as more mind than body? And we already put Eli up there, but really we wanted to look at something even more extreme here. So we thought, okay, well, what about God? This is an interesting agent. And sorry to have such a Christian representation of God. You can think of it in other ways as well. Most of our participants were Christian here. And so we asked across all of these different targets, again, asking about these different needs. So how important is feeling loved, for example, to God? So some of these questions are a little bit strange, but we're trying to tease out the way that people are thinking about them. And what we would expect to see is a complete reversal for the God agent here, that for God, people are thinking of the psychological needs as being more important than the physical needs. Of course, this might be moderated a bit by the way that you think about God. We did look at the belief in God as an individual difference measure. That turned out really not to moderate anything, actually. Okay, so let me show you the results here. So chimpanzee, we've already seen that from the last slide. So certainly, the people are demeaning that agent. Psychological needs seen as less important than the physical needs. And then self, both physical and psychological are important, although even here, physical is more important than psychological. And then what about God? There we do see this complete reversal in the pattern. There's also a main effect. God isn't necessarily seen as being a biological being, so all of the needs are sort of seen as lower, but the reversal is, of interest to us. Okay. And then what about peers' needs? So we talked about that a little bit already. So we went into the MBA classroom for this, just convenient sample here. So Chicago Booth, and then at Haas as well. We don't think there's anything unique about these MBA schools, by the way. And we just asked them, and we actually had them make trade-offs here. So we changed the scale a little bit. So we forced them to say, compared to yourself, compared to the average student, to what extent are these different needs important to you? Okay, so higher up on the scale here means that people say that the need is more important to them. Lower down the scale means that they're saying it's less important to them. And then here are all the needs again, in case you forgot them. I put them back on the scale there. And so what you see is anything above 0 means more important to you. Already from the way I'm displaying this figure, everything is above 0, you can see. And so people are saying everything is more important to them. And so even for the low level needs, you see this as happening. This is particularly turned out driven by the sleep item. People think sleep is more important to them than the average MBA peer student. You also see this for middle level needs, pretty similar to low level needs actually. And then the higher level needs is where you get the biggest effect here. So here is really people say, okay, but the psychological things are really more important to me than to an average MBA student. Okay, and then we think this has some interesting consequences. So one thing that I already talked about a little bit is the extrinsic incentives bias, which we think is in part due to these different perceptions of the needs that people have and that the average other person has. And so you can ask the same type of question, but instead of asking about needs, you can ask about different types of incentives. Incentives that are maybe seen as satisfying more of the physical needs versus incentives that are seen as satisfying more of the psychological needs. And so here, you see a similar pattern with the extrinsic incentives. So everyone thinks that those things are more important to them than to their average peer. But that's particularly true of the intrinsic incentives compared to the extrinsic incentives. And this is actually fully mediated by perceptions of needs for what that's worth. Okay. And then we actually did a spin-off paper I'll just mention here, which is I found this so interesting. I started looking at how people think about the workplace and people's perceptions of needs in the workplace. And we have this finding that people do want more intrinsic incentives, meaning and purpose at work than people realize. So you can look at that paper if you're curious about that. Okay, so one thing you might be thinking of here, there's a lot of, everyone who's ever done work on self-other differences knows that like asking about the average other person is this, unrepresented, people don't really know what that stimulus actually is. It's not really clear who that would even be and who people are really thinking of there. There's been like a lot of great work that's looked at this. So we did want to just make sure that it's not just about people having a baseline perception of average, and that we wanted to look at like an individuated other or even like a close other. And for close others, we actually think that this effect should diminish quite a bit. You remember you already saw in the close friend from the data I presented earlier that that a lot of that effect does go away, but there should be still something that remains because of this difference in introspection axis. So even with a close friend, you don't quite have the same access into their mind as you do for yours. So still there should be something that remains there. And so here we have a similar design, but we have 3 different comparison groups. So one was compared to the average MBA student, that's the average peer condition. Another is the person who answered the survey right before you. Okay, so that's the individuated other condition. And then finally, you've got the friend condition, your closest friend at that school. Okay, and so essentially what you see is that for the average peer, we completely replicate what we saw before. It's the high level needs that people find more important to themselves than to others. Individuated peer, the exact same pattern. There's a main effect here that we didn't necessarily predict, but the pattern is the same. And then for the friend, still, you see your needs as being a little bit more important than your friends. It's not the same pattern, so you don't see that as being more the case on the high level needs. I mentioned we also measured another perceptions of intelligence, which you can see follows kind of a similar pattern, but doesn't fully predict the results. So we don't think this is just about positivity per se. We think that it's more about introspective access is what's going on here.
Juliana, can I ask a question, a conceptual question? I guess I'm just wondering the difference between dehumanization and maybe a mistake in perspective taking or an inability to perspective take accurately. And I'm thinking about that for the friend, because I don't know that you find the friend is any more technically dehumanized on those measures that you showed earlier. So I guess I'm curious as to, I guess, what dehumanization means in this sense.
Can you say a little bit more? Yeah, because there were a couple different points in there. Just clarify a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess do we dehumanize our friends? Is that like something that happens? And if so, how do we do so?
Yeah, okay, so for the friend, here, let me go back. You're right, we don't see that same pattern. We don't see that kind of demeaning pattern where they rate the psychological needs as being significantly more important than the physical needs compared to the self. But we do see this kind of main, if there's something different going on there, just this main effect, very small, but significantly above 0 here, where people think of all of their needs as being more important than a friend's needs. And so I guess I would say, yeah, I don't think we would call this dehumanization. We just say, lacking introspective access. So, you don't have perfect insight into everything that your friend is thinking. You should definitely have more, right? And in fact, we didn't actually run this study, but I think, what we would expect is that the more that you engage, like communicating with another person and uncovering, their deeper desires and thoughts and just learning more about their mind, the more you would expect that this demeaning effect would start to go away. And so that kind of deeper level access that occurs through communication as opposed to just observing someone, that should diminish the effect. And so with a close friend, presumably you're having a lot of these conversations, so that's part of what diminishes the effect. Okay, so I'm just gonna like really quickly skim through this because I want to get to something a little more fun. But part of what we think might be happening here is that people, for the exact same activity, like take an activity like relaxing or eating or other things, they think of the reasons why they do those as being more psychological in nature than more physical in nature. So what you can say is like for yourself, why do you engage in these different activities? Basically, people say like somewhat more on the psychological side. For the other, they say that's more on the they're doing these activities more to satisfy physical needs. And so that's like a little bit of some of the psychology we think is going on here. It's like even when you see people doing the exact same things, you're making like pretty different inferences about why they're doing those things for yourself compared to for others. Okay, but so I think this is a study that this audience might be interested in. So we wanted to understand a little bit more about what the differences in needs actually are. So maybe you might be thinking that they're, especially for the opening example, and that's kind of been a theme throughout the whole talk, thinking about homeless people, maybe they actually would say that they have more important physical needs than psychological needs. That kind of would purport with Maslow's hierarchy that those are the more fundamental needs that need to be satisfied. And so perhaps, people, when they're rating these individuals' needs as the physical needs as being less or more important, that actually kind of comports with reality to some extent. Okay, so we did want to understand that relationship. And so we went to a charity. We partnered with a charity, Respond Now. And then we went to their holiday gift drive. So we captured charity donors' experiences and charity recipients' experiences at the gift drive. We physically went there and surveyed them. It's pre-COVID times. And the survey was just pretty simple. We simplified it quite a bit. We asked the donors to rate their own needs. So how important is the need for food or for love or for meaning? We actually selected particular needs that loaded the most high, the items that loaded the most highly on each of those different factors. And so those items happen to be food, love, and meaning. So those are the ones we used. And then we had them predict recipients' needs. All right, so to a typical charity recipient, how important is the need for food, for love, and for meaning? And then we had recipients rating their own needs and predicting donors' needs. All right, so we can now see, do people perceive the needs of these other groups differently, but also how does that compare to what the other group actually says about their needs? All right, so and so here's what the data looked like. We changed the scale from 1 to 10 on the y-axis here. It just was more intuitive for the participants. And so first for the donors, so they do indeed, rate all of these needs as being highly important to them. We're getting close to ceiling here. All of those needs matter to them. Not surprising at all. What do they predict are recipients' needs? So here you see this effect we've seen in all the other studies. They predict that recipients have less important psychological needs, the need for meaning in particular here compared to the physical needs. So this is, this is what we would call like they're dehumanizing the recipient's needs by comparing the psychological need perceptions here. And then what about recipients? What do they say? They actually say that all of their needs are important. Okay, so they rate all of them as being important. So there's the donors actually mispredicting the recipient's needs, at least compared to the recipient's own self-report here. And then what do the recipients predict about the donors? So they predict that the donors' needs are actually quite similar to what the donors report their own needs are. Because we don't see any evidence of recipients dehumanizing the donors' needs in this sense. And that might be because donors are one of those groups that are seen as being highly characterized as having a need for psychological need. Okay. So we thought this was interesting. We also did it with ranking. So we forced people to rank because you might be wondering, well, talk is cheap. And you actually see the exact same pattern there. And I'll mention we did a follow-up where we asked recipients to make predictions about other recipients' needs. And there we actually see that recipients dehumanize other recipients. So recipients perceive other recipients just like this pattern right here. Okay, and then we wanted to look at, and Mary, this is where you might be interested. We want to look at some consequences of this. So does this influence these different perceptions of needs? Donors maybe mispredictions of recipients' needs. Does that influence the types of gifts that they give them? So we were at that donation drive so we could look at what was actually given. And it's a little bit challenging to think about what are the gifts that satisfy like the higher level needs. So lower level, pretty easy. You can just look at like cans of food, right? So need for, you think someone has a need for food, you're going to give them food probably. What about the higher level needs? So there we actually just looked at cash and cash equivalents like gas cards. And so what we did is we asked the donors, what was the gift that you actually donated, and recipients, what did you receive? And then recipients, what did you actually want to get here? All right, and so what you see is that the donors are reporting, so this is the percentage frequency of these coded gifts. They're reporting that they gave food more than cash. Recipients are definitely saying that they received a lot more food than cash. In fact, I don't know where the cash went because recipients don't say they got any of it. Excuse me. Recipients' ideal gift is not that. They want to get cash. And then donors actually know that. So the donors actually are predicting that correctly, which is interesting because it suggests there's something going on here. There's probably, in terms of why people give food and why people give cash, there's a lot of different reasons for that, right? And Mary, you've looked at a lot of this stuff, and there's norms, there are other things that might be going on here, but we think one thing is perceptions of needs. We actually wrote a whole nother paper on this where we look at paternalism towards individuals that seem to have lower psychological needs. But yeah,
interesting.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you actually, so based on, I know you did a couple studies looking at donors and homeless recipients, and my impression of a lot of charity appeals are focusing on sort of the negative emotions that the recipient is feeling. And I wonder, I think in a lot of this work, you've hypothesized that a lot of this is been driven by the more cognitive dimension of mind perception, and that, like, what we really want to be doing is helping donors have more of a sense of the mind or the cognitive capacity of these recipients if we want to try to nudge them to give the kind of gifts that the recipients actually want to receive. And so I was curious, what advice would you have for creating charity appeals that might better encourage donors to match the needs of recipients?
It's a great question. Yeah, we've thought a lot about this. So one thing that's interesting when we talk to different charities is that they sometimes talk about how dehumanizing perceptions of the recipients can be motivating. So thinking of recipients as not being able to satisfy their own needs, and that makes people feel like they want to help them more. And sometimes you see this in terms of, maybe this is what you're referring to, Mary, in terms of the way that they might advertise towards recipients. Towards other donors, that they're framing the recipients as kind of these dehumanized individuals, and putting them into squalid circumstances, and that might be seen as motivating in a way. But I think what we find in this other paper that I mentioned here is that it doesn't really, you don't see huge differences in the amount that people are willing to give as a function of whether or not the target seems to be lacking mental capacity, more dehumanized or not. It's more about the way in which they give, and they tend to be more paternalistic. So we just had someone in the chat in the Q&A say, a lot of people don't give cash because they believe it'll be used to fuel drug addiction. And this is kind of exactly the mentality that we find in this other paper, which is that people are worried about individuals wasting cash, right? And in fact, one of the ending examples I was going to talk about is this extreme outrage that occurs when people use food stamps for what are seen as luxury items like steak or lobster, right? And there's of course there's a lot of psychology in terms of people don't want to waste, right? They don't want to give money that people are seen as wasting. But I think there's also this sense of, hey, you need to focus on the physical needs. Those need to be addressed first before you can get to the psychological needs. The reason why the giving tends to be so paternalistic is because there's this concern that they're not going to be able to use the aid wisely, and they need to have someone figure out how to use it for them. But that's a whole nother, yeah, we could go into that. I think it's fascinating. And I'll just say that briefly that we basically conceptually replicated this in a different sample, like with students and homeless people in the Berkeley area. So the lead research assistant who went to all the homeless people in the Berkeley area and collected all this data, I think she's a PhD student at UCLA, so she's on this call today. We looked at a different consequence here, which is preferences for like a meal program versus a wellness program. And you see that for homeless people, they say they're kind of torn between which one they would attend, but students predict that they're going to be much more interested in the meal program, which comports with their perceptions of the needs of the homeless people. Okay, so I realize we're getting close to time, and so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up here. So overall, what we explore in this research is human behavior is complex. It's guided by all these different needs. Some of those needs are more psychological in nature. Some of them are more physiological in nature. And so what we're showing is that there seems to be this systematic difference in the ways that we recognize these needs in ourselves and in others, such that others are more driven by the physical lower level needs than the self is, and less driven by those psychological needs. And this is even more the case for these dehumanized group members, and has potential consequences for how we choose to help others. And I will just go ahead and say, well, I'll say thank you here. So thank you guys so much for your time. This is really fun. This is great. Thank you so much for inviting me, Leif, Joe, and Yuri.
Thank you so much, Juliana. That was really great. And thanks to all the panelists for being here and to all of the audience for coming and listening. All of your Q&A will get to Juliana and Nick, so they'll be able to read it and be influenced by it. Thanks, everybody. We will do this again next week. All right, enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, everyone.